Lena Miller is my name, and I was taught a painful lesson in my family at a young age. No one ever got love evenly. Ethan. My oldest brother was always regarded by my parents as the ideal child. Despite my best efforts, I would never be able to compete with him. He received recognition for all of his efforts. Every small accomplishment was a moment, and myself. The shadow in the background was myself, only observed when tasks needed to be completed, or when they required a comparable individual. That Christmas when I was 7 years old is still fresh in my mind. The largest box beneath the tree was torn open by Ethan, and the sight of the newest gaming console made his face light up. The one that all children desired. My parents smiled. The scene was even captured on my mother's phone. I waited for my turn while sitting quietly, attempting to avoid raising my expectations too high. Still, a tiny, hopeful part of me held out hope, remained convinced. As I opened my present, the T-shirt was gray. From a rack of clearance, $3.99 shows a plumbing company's emblem on it. Too large, too unsightly, as well as something that clearly no one had bothered to choose for me. With a smile, my mother said, "You should learn to be content, sweetie. Since Ethan is older, he requires more significant items." I made an effort to grin, sat in the corner in silence, observing Ethan while he plays his new game. His excited face was lit up by the screen's glow. As I fought back tears, the holidays never got any better. For the 16th birthday of Ethan, at a park by a lake, they gave him a massive outdoor party, accompanied by a brand new Ford with a red ribbon on top and a live band. The whole neighborhood showed up. For myself, 2 buddies were invited over for frozen pizza, sat in our living room under the dim yellow light. A cheap notebook and a ballpoint pen were my birthday presents. Not even one that's cute. Those nice folks give away for free at job fairs. My father remarked, "You're realistic. There's nothing fancy you need." However, Ethan had all the luxuries, even though he didn't need to inquire. After he left for college, my folks took care of everything, spending money, rent, and tuition. What about me? I received numerous applications for school loans, and a lengthy talk about maturing and becoming self-sufficient. Nobody inquired about my well-being, if I was eating enough, or whether I was worn out from putting in late hours to make ends meet. I once thought that if I put in enough effort, things would be different. However, when I graduated, that final glimmer of optimism was vanished. There was a party in the backyard when Ethan got home. Poppers with confetti, a cake with 3 layers. From family, cheers. He was given a starting home in the northern suburbs by my parents, in appreciation of all his hard work. Me. I entered our tiny eating area where my folks sat alone. Accompanied with a box of fast food for takeaway, I was given a simple white envelope. I was hoping it would be a tiny check to cover the rest of my tuition. However, a $2 scratch-off lottery ticket was found inside. "Just for fun," my mother answered with a smile, as if it were the sweetest prank ever. "Perhaps you'll succeed." I glanced up at them. They both appeared innocent, or even uncomfortable. My father shrugged. "As you are aware, we invested all of our money in Ethan's home." I grinned, but it was hollow and worn out. I folded the ticket and put it in my old coat pocket, and gave a nod. I wasn't angry on the inside, though. I had nothing. As it happens, my family's true plan never included me. And I was starting to realize that if I wanted to have a role in this world, I would need to create it myself, without anticipating that someone would give it to me. Following that quiet graduation meal, everything the first owned was packed. Worn-out clothing, a damaged laptop with a crimson suitcase that was chipped, and departed from the house where I had never felt really at home. I rented a small studio apartment in Cleveland's downtown, where the orange glare of streetlights and the sound of automobile horns at midnight took the place of my parents' icy silence. I could hardly fit one bed in my place, a little desk. Additionally, there was a loud electric stove that buzzed each time I switched it on. The walls had an off-white stain on them when it grew cold. The pipes began to leak, and the neighbors' conflicts made their way through the paper-thin walls. At least it was mine, though. Nobody made fun of me. I was never likened to Ethan. Nobody told me to be thankful for the holiday sales on clothing. To make ends meet, I worked 2 jobs. I worked as a marketing assistant for a small billboard company throughout the day, and I worked in a bakery close to the market at night, up till almost midnight, cleaning tables, serving guests, and putting away the trash. During those initial weeks, I returned home with sore feet, hands that smelled like fried grease and flour. However, I was lighter than I had ever been at home. My family didn't text that often, never gave me a call to check on me. Within the family group chat, Ethan was still at the center of everything. He would pose with his new car in pictures that my mom would send, in their recently renovated living room, or grinning. For the third time, videos of Ethan and his girlfriend enjoying a Florida trip were provided by my dad, accompanied by the caption, "The child deserves everything." I never participated in those discussions. Even when I made a quick check-in, "Hey, how are you all doing?" Only a few generic emojis were used in the responses. At times, I pondered, if I vanished, would anyone notice at all? On graduation night, my mother gave me a $2 lottery ticket, still in the kitchen's adjacent drawer, buried beneath a handful of coins, a dehydrated pen, and a power bill that is past due. I didn't bother scratching it. It served as a sobering reminder to me that, from my parents' perspective, I was just worth that, a remote possibility, rather than a genuine investment. Each evening, I wouldn't open that drawer. I would occasionally touch the ticket's creased edge with my fingers, then close it once more. I reminded myself that I was accustomed to being ignored, that I didn't require anybody's blessing. However, occasionally, during the calmest moments, my mother's voice would continue to reverberate in my head. "Ethan requires more." Under my flesh, like a splinter, I took it with me, even while you're asleep. After that, on a Friday night, one of my coworkers asked me to a modest party. As I sat at the dessert table in silence, Marissa, a member of the creative team, struck up a conversation with me. After some time, discussing employment, she inquired with a smile and a head twist, "Why don't you ever discuss your family with me?" "Lena." After hesitating, I simply said, "Perhaps because I was never truly seen as a part of it." Marissa refrained from crying. She simply nodded, as if she knew better than anyone had. That sense of having been heard without passing judgment felt like a small fissure forming in my innermost being. The days that followed were a haze. I opened the drawer when I got home from the party that evening, the one where the ticket is still hidden under old receipts, coins, and pens. I pulled it out for the first time in months. The scratch-off ticket, the one my mother joked with me, the one meant to serve as a reminder of my low value in their eyes. I grasped it as though it were a delicate object, like if I didn't handle it gently, it might break. I gazed at it for a while. I traced the edge of the rumpled paper with my fingers. I was careful not to scratch it. There was no need for me to scratch it. However, something had changed within me. Perhaps it was what Marissa said, or perhaps it was the silent storm that had been brewing inside of me for years. I wasn't doing this to prove anything to anyone for the first time. My family wasn't the reason I did it, or for whoever had ever written me off. I did it for myself, only me. I carefully scraped the silver, covering off the coin. Just one figure, then another. The numbers 8, 14, 27, 33, 42, 56. My heart fell. I blinked. I couldn't believe what I was witnessing. For a moment, I was unable to breathe. It didn't appear genuine. I took out my phone, displayed the website for the Ohio lottery, and entered the digits. "Congrats! You've won the big prize, $134 million. All I did was look at the screen. $134 million. I blinked several times. Had I just won, really? It wasn't a joke. It wasn't some nasty turn of events. It was authentic. It seemed oppressive to be surrounded by an apartment. I had to take a breath. However, the air felt dense, as if I couldn't shake the sensations. I didn't yell, didn't do the jumping motions seen in movies. I simply sat there and gazed at the ticket, shuddering, quiet, incapable of processing it. However, one thing was evident: it was all going to change. That evening, I didn't make any phone calls. I kept my folks in the dark. I kept it a secret, since I was aware of, if I gave them a call, how I felt would not matter to them. They refused to inquire about my well-being. They would inquire as to how much I would divulge to them. They would inquire about their possible amount. I therefore took the one logical action. I went on the internet. In the search bar, I typed, "When you win the lotto, what should you do?" There were hundreds of results. The majority of them contained advice on maintaining anonymity, about keeping your identity safe. However, one story in particular caught our attention. It wasn't ostentatious. There was neither enthusiasm nor panic. It was clear, peaceful, and useful. First things first, keep it a secret. Locate a financial counselor. I inhaled deeply and jotted down several names. I was unsure about where to begin, unsure of whom to believe. I realized, however, that I couldn't accomplish this by myself. I gave Carol Whitman a call the following morning. She was regarded as one of the region's top financial advisors. Her office was located downtown on the 19th level of a glass tower, the type of structure I used to pass. I'm dreaming that I might fit in there someday. I nearly skipped my first meeting since I was so anxious before it. I nearly pulled back. However, I forced myself to do it. I had to confirm that this was genuine, that I wasn't in a fantasy world. Carol shook my hand firmly as she greeted me. Her eyes were sweet but piercing. I wasn't treated like a lucky winner by her. She acted as though I had actually made a decision. Someone with choices. Lena, you just made a big decision. After I told her everything, she said, we will ensure that this opportunity does not pass us by. She didn't mince words. The jackpot didn't impress her. She was intent, I mean it, for the following 3 hours. Carol and her group assisted me in formulating a strategy, a plan that would safeguard my identity, protect my money, and enable me to live a life devoid of the kinds of demands that had previously burdened me. To claim the prize, we established an LLC in order for me to remain anonymous. They summoned a tax lawyer in, as well as an expert in investments. I was surrounded by knowledgeable individuals, folks who didn't simply treat me like a winner, but as a person. When I walked out of their office, I experienced an odd feeling of peace. I wasn't yet wealthy. However, I was headed toward something I had never imagined. The processing of everything takes roughly a week. Next, I looked at my bank account, $85 million. Following taxes, I remained motionless, gazing at the television. It was the most zeros I had ever seen. I had the impression that I was viewing someone else's life, as if it weren't mine. However, it was. I owned it. Additionally, I've never in my life I thought I was finally in charge of something. I started by paying off all of my student loans, each and every dime. My credit cards come next. All balances were cleared. I didn't purchase anything ostentatious. I did not suddenly go out and purchase a mansion. Rather, I relocated to Cleveland Heights to live in a modest, peaceful home, a location that seemed tranquil, and away from the clamor of my history. The place was not a mansion, however, it belonged to me. A few weeks went by. I also had the impression that each morning was a fresh start. The sensation that something wasn't real persisted in my mind. However, it grew more apparent every day. My new reality was this. I had created a life for myself, without the affirmation or acceptance of others. I was able to breathe. At last, I could occupy space. However, I still had issues to deal with, things that I had spent too much time avoiding. Similar to the family, I had kept the lottery victory a secret from them, and truthfully, I had no desire to. I was fully aware of what they would say, how they would request money from me, the way they'd act as though I owed them something as if I couldn't keep what was mine. I didn't want to allow them to diminish me once more. However, my phone buzzed one night with a message from Mom. It wasn't shocking. I still felt sick to my stomach, though. It had been weeks since I last heard from her directly, merely the sporadic family update in the messaging app. However, this felt different. We must speak. Lena, I'm concerned about you. I didn't answer. The communication was not even opened by me. Rather, I sat there and gazed at the TV, pondering how I had arrived, how I had turned into someone who was so forgettable, till I at last discovered my own strength. After a few days, Ethan sent me another message. I paused once more. Shall the first open it? It wasn't as though he had ever contacted me unless he needed something. But curiosity prevailed. I gave the screen a tap. Hi, Lena. Mom has been rather agitated. She's been acting rather emotional recently. I'm not sure if you've noticed that. She has inquired about you. Why haven't you been answering her messages? I was unsure of how to react. I wanted to lash out, yet tell him I was sick of being the one they didn't care about. The person who wasn't deserving of a meaningful discussion. However, I didn't. Rather, I set my phone aside, inhaled deeply, and gave it some thought. They had always regarded me as if I were merely present, not an individual, but a shadow, and here they were now, attempting to entice me back in. As though a few courteous messages could erase everything that had transpired. The following day, I took a car to my former home. I was unwilling to. However, I felt compelled to view them. Curiosity, perhaps. Perhaps it was the allure of ingrained behaviors. I parked in front of the house I knew, the person I once thought would return my affection. The fence with white pickets, the weathered stone pathway. I had never owned the porch swing. I stood there for a while, simply observing it. I had no feelings, no sentimentality, no desire. The door was opened by Mom, and I felt that old surge of emotions again, the overpowering aroma of cleaning supplies, the background hum of the refrigerator, the sound of the television coming from a different room. She drew me into an embrace. It was too tight, as if she were attempting to impose the affection she never showed. She took a step back to gaze at me and observed, "You've lost weight." I didn't answer. I simply went into the kitchen after her. Dad was seated at the table there, examining the newspaper. Only when I sat down did they look up at me. Ethan was the next person. The person who remained silent the most. However, his presence was very noticeable. He hugged me tightly, took a seat across from me. He gave me the impression that he was waiting for something. The exchange went just as I had hoped. Everything revolved around Ethan's most recent achievements, regarding his new vehicle, regarding Haley's wedding plans. I was shown photos of the house they were remodeling by my mother, and she even produced a drawing of the nursery they were constructing for their unborn child. They never inquired about my well-being. They never really showed any interest in me, in my own life. I merely watched. I could sense the annoyance rising in my chest, the same annoyance I'd had throughout my life. When they simply thought of me as someone who should be pleased for them, glad to be a part of their strategy, yet never considered equal. Then Mom said something. She had a smooth voice. However, there was a hint of danger. "Lena, we've been considering, given all of the events involving Ethan and Haley, as well as the house." She walked away, and I was aware of what was going to happen. They always managed to make a request without actually stating it. She went on, "We were hoping you might be able to help us out a bit. Perhaps. The new garage will cost $100.0 so. To assist with the costs of the wedding, you know. And a few more items." Dad gave a nod, like this was a straightforward request from family. Ethan reclined in his seat, awaiting my reply. For a while, I was at a loss for words. I thought I was choking, like though everything that had been accumulating inside of me was going to explode. However, I remained composed. I spoke steadily. I glanced at my mother, then at Ethan, and I mutely inquired, when I was in college, where was my family? When I had to work 2 jobs to pay my rent? When I spent weeks eating only ramen to pay for textbooks, where was my family? There was silence in the room. Nobody said anything. Mom's expression wavered, but she remained silent. Ethan was at a loss for words, his gaze straying from me. At last, I got up, grabbed my handbag, and gave them a final glance. "I apologize," I said. "However, I've now established a life for myself. Furthermore, I owe you nothing." I turned around and left, the door gently shutting behind me, leaving their expectations, their words, their requests behind me. The weeks that followed were quieter than I had anticipated. I didn't speak to any of my relatives. Not my mother, not Ethan. I felt no remorse. I was not depressed. For the first time, I sensed, in harmony. My days were spent getting used to this new existence. For the first time in my life, it felt like mine. When I wanted to, I woke up, ate food that I genuinely liked, and relaxed on my balcony in the sun. I never had time to read books or drink tea. It wasn't the luxury of independence, it was the liberty of existence. I didn't look for messages from the family group chat on my phone. Rumors were whispered behind my back, but I ignored them. The flimsy inquiries and the pictures of Ethan's new life didn't interest me. Rather, I began to concentrate on what gave me a sense of completeness. I started writing once more, not for cash, not for anybody else, only for me. I penned tales about little heroes, silent insurgents, individuals who battled independently, as I had always desired to see those tales, but had never come upon them in my surroundings. During my free time, I started painting, mostly watercolors. Not very fancy, simple, untidy color explorations on paper. Additionally, one afternoon, I was seated in my living room while the sky outside my window is painted. A tap on the door caught my attention. I didn't think anyone would show up, not at all. But I had a feeling it was time. I unlocked the door, and a gift was waiting for me, sent by courier. I dragged it inside. I have a strange tightness in my chest. I have no idea who it came from, and I didn't give a damn. However, it seemed like this moment I was attempting to create this peaceful life was going to change in some way. Within the bundle, the book was little and heavy. Its cover was simple, no title, no pictures. Just a white ribbon wrapped around a thick cardboard cover. I took it open. There, legibly written in cursive, was just one word, Sarah. My heart fell. I took a seat on the sofa, looking incredulously at the book. It was a letter from Mom. The initial remarks were courteous. However, they felt empty, my dear. I am aware that we have had disagreements. However, I do miss you. You are on my mind every single day. I read on. The letter was lengthy, brimming with excuses and justifications. However, I felt nothing. Not rage, not remorse. Simply void. The actual events were not acknowledged in the letter. It failed to acknowledge my suffering, my battle, the years of being kicked out. I wasn't asked how I was feeling. It prevented me from feeling my own pain. Rather, it seemed like an effort to reintegrate me, to give me the impression that I owed them something. I set the letter aside after folding it. I didn't give her a call. I didn't answer. I was unable to return. I refused to allow them to change the narrative. I had been invisible for far too long, waiting for them to see me for too long. That night, I pondered the meaning of it all, regarding my current existence, about my progress, and the more I considered it, the more I understood that I had made this my life's choice. I wasn't handed this existence by anyone. I owned it, and I had to live with it alone. The following morning, I got up early, made coffee, and took a seat to write further. I composed the opening line of a brand new narrative, the story of a woman navigating in a fog, anything about realizing her true self, above and beyond the labels and expectations. At that moment, I realized, for the first time, that my future was being written by me, sentence by sentence. Later on in the week, my encounter with Carol was my financial counselor. Now, she was more than that. She was a companion, a guide who had guided me through this daunting new environment. We discussed investing, regarding safeguarding my future. However, we also discussed life, what living it on my own terms actually meant. Carol had always warned me to use caution. However, on that day, she made a statement that stuck. Life doesn't wait for approval. Lena, money isn't the main factor. Taking what you have and transforming it into your own is the goal, and I had done precisely that. I had risked something. I had started from nothing in my life. Currently, I was still alive. The next few days were different, as if everything had just fallen into place. It was more than just the cash, or the liberty, or the house I'd spent so much time building in Cleveland Heights. There was more to it, something deeper. I no longer required approval from others. Not from my parents, not from Ethan, not from the life they had planned for me, however. Finally, I had emerged from the shadows they had put over me, and I had created my own illumination. My days were spent in my new house, writing, creating art, and just existing. The burden I bore for a long time, the burden of never measuring up, it was gone. I avoided social media, keep to myself. The rumors were no longer important to me. Addressing inquiries about the source of the funds. Regarding the murmured, "Have you heard about Lena?" It made no difference. What I had created for myself was what counted. However, that did not imply that I was completely content. I had made every effort to distance myself from the past. However, the past managed to slink back in. One afternoon, it returned. While seated on my porch, observing the maple trees in my yard as their leaves fall, it buzzed on my phone. Ethan had left a message. "We really need to talk. Lena, Mom has been attempting to contact you. She's not growing any younger, and she's still upset. Let's clear the air, please." I gazed at the text. He had already reached out once before. However, something about his delivery this time, Mom's not getting any younger, something about that reminded me that time was running out, thinking I was meant to make everything right somehow. I took a while to reply. I didn't think I had to explain why I hadn't spoken. However, later that night, I ended myself heading in the direction of the old house. I had no idea why. Perhaps the first needed to find closure. Perhaps I simply wanted to see them again. As I entered the driveway, the house had the same appearance. Fresh paint has been applied to the white picket fence. The lawn is well kept, and my mother was standing at the front entrance. She stood there, awaiting with her arms folded across her chest. I exited the vehicle and approached her. At first, she remained silent. Her eyes were just fixed on me. I was once made to feel invisible by those same eyes. Finally, in a tremulous voice, she said, "Lena, I've had a lot on my mind, almost anything." I remained silent. I simply stood there, awaiting. "I apologize," she added. However, I didn't get the kind of apology I was hoping for. It wasn't an expression of regret for the years of disregard, for the offensive remarks, because they had consistently picked Ethan over me. It was an expression of regret for having to come to terms with the fact that something was amiss. "I simply assumed that you would always be there. Lena, I believed we could always rely on you. Regardless. But now everything is different." My stomach twisted in that old knot of rage. However, I remained silent. I simply left her words hanging, similar to a cloud that has been building for too long. Next, for the very first time, I mustered the courage to speak. "Mom, you don't have to rely on me anymore." The words were sharper than I thought they would be. "There are other important members of this family besides Ethan. I've worked my entire life to demonstrate that to you. However, I'm no longer able to accomplish it. I'm not here to help you with anything. Picking up the pieces you left behind is not why I'm here." She flinched. She started to say something, but however, I raised my hand. "You may have finally come to terms with the fact that I won't be returning to your world. However, my anger has subsided. I just have had enough of trying to fit into a life that never made room for me." She refrained from crying. She simply nodded, as though she comprehended. That was the end of it. I needed that last bit of closure. Not a big, tearful reunion, not some grand reconciliation moment. Just the knowledge that I had at last made my own decision. I turned and made my way back to my vehicle. As I drove away from the home where my hopes had once been, my annoyance, and my suffering, it was done. I didn't have to pardon them because I no longer had to. The following day, I took a seat at my desk and resumed writing. This time with a purpose I had never experienced before. I wrote exclusively for myself. I didn't write to win people over or to obtain consent. For me, I wrote. Carol and I also started collaborating on new investments. I had the upper hand this time. I wasn't merely getting by anymore. I was doing well, after several months. And gradually, I started to feel as though my life had been waiting for me all along. The sun shone brighter. The air is more clear. And the burden I'm carrying, lost. I took a trip, not to go away, but to investigate. I visited the coast. I'm in Santa Barbara, drinking coffee. I went hiking in the old forests of Oregon. In Savannah, I would spend many evenings watching fireworks. Not because I was attempting to flee anything, but because I had arrived at last to somewhere I could just be. And after I got back, I had a different feeling on a Saturday afternoon while I waited for my order at my preferred downtown organic bakery. Behind me, I heard a voice. Ethan was the one. Naturally, he stood there, a little unkempt. His strained smile, as though he wasn't sure whether to feel guilty or thrilled. He remarked, "I didn't expect to see you here." His voice was unsteady. "You currently reside here." I gave a nod. "Indeed." Nearby. Ethan paused. He fidgeted with his hands by his sides. "I suppose I simply wanted to apologize. Lena, I ought to have put in more effort. I am aware that it hasn't been simple." I looked at him for a while, then gave a nod. "I understand. Ethan, however, I've discovered that I can be whole without anyone's apologies." He gave me a glance. His eyes were a mixture of comprehension and guilt. With a calmer tone, he said, "I hope you're happy." "Lena, I am," I said with a soft smile. "I am," I said. That was the end of it. The chapter's conclusion. A life I had outgrown coming to an end. Learning that you don't need anyone's approval to live the life you deserve can occasionally be the most difficult lesson. To those who have disregarded you, you don't have to establish your value, or anticipated you becoming someone you're not. Success and wealth do not lead to true freedom, but from the silent strength of self-determination. even if it means leaving behind what is comfortable. You have always had the right to assert your value. You simply must quit waiting for other people to acknowledge it.